Hello, everyone. Great to be with you on this Thursday evening. I'm Misa Jeffereis. I'm Assistant Curator at CAM. I had the great pleasure and honor of organizing the 2020 Great Rivers Biennial. I'm really happy to be joined tonight by our GRB jurors and artists, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. But before I bring on our panelists, I wanted to say that typically this panel discussion would have happened in person the day after the opening of the exhibition. It's always a really celebratory moment. We would have brought our wonderful jurors back to spend time with us and the artists and give them the opportunity to see the exhibitions in person. But unfortunately, since travel is still unsafe, we decided a couple of months ago to conduct the panel on Zoom and to make the most of it. And I'm sure we're going to have a really fantastic time tonight. So thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you to the Gateway Foundation for their amazing support of this program over the past nearly 2 decades. I also wanted to use this opportunity to thank my colleagues at CAM, especially Lisa and Wesson, for their guidance and support throughout this process. I'd also like to thank our registrar, Jen, and the installation crew for all of their hard work installing the shows. Since we're doing this program virtually and not in the museum, we can't assume that all of you have seen the exhibitions. I know that some of you might not have made it to the museum lately, so before we begin our discussion, I wanted to play some video documentation of each of the 3 shows to kind of give you a sense of them. So each artist has kindly agreed to say a few words about their exhibition, and we've got a lot to cover tonight. I'd like to just dive right in and start by inviting Tim Portlock to give a short intro to his exhibition, Nickels from Heaven. And so we'll go ahead and start his video. And Tim, would you mind joining us now?
Thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you, Misa. Thank you, Cam and Jurors. So I've been making cityscape images for about the last 10 years. I've been using visual effects software to focus on specific details of particular cities to make these images. I particularly focus on empty and abandoned buildings in cities. I'm really interested in the scale and volume of the buildings in a given city and what kind of story that might tell about a particular place. I use the conventions of 19th century American landscape painting to present these buildings. And maybe about 3 years ago, I started to rethink my project and my focus. When I started making this work was about the time of this beginning of the 2008 economic collapse. And I think that the idea or the public perception of what an abandoned building signified has changed. Most big American cities are, or at least up until 9 months ago, were full of construction cranes. So that caused me to rethink how I made my images. So for this body of work, I have a lot of construction sites and abandoned buildings. And I'm really thinking about how new buildings and old buildings both present a particular set of social models. And so destroying and building implies something to me about our what kind of society that we're imagining going forward.
Great. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Fantastic. So next, I would like to introduce Rachel Youn, another of our GRB award winners, to share a little bit about their exhibition called Gather. And we will hear from Rachel first and then play the video walkthrough, just because the installation has an audio component. We don't want Rachel to have to scream over the video. So with that, Rachel, thanks for sharing.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. So my exhibition entitled Gather is a big party of sculptures, really. The entire installation is full of kinetic sculptures, which are these massagers that I've bought secondhand from people all over the St. Louis and Illinois region. When you walk into the show, there's all these artificial plants that are flailing around. Some might even hit you while you're walking through. You'll also hear 2 different audio tracks when you're in there. There's a dance track that was commissioned by a local, that I commissioned a local band, God's Bod, to create, as well as Korean church music that kind of contrasts against it. It's a really kind of colorful site. There's a disco ball going and different kinds of lights. And it really is meant to kind of evoke a space where people can be vulnerable with their bodies. And it has been, over the past 5 months, slowly destroying itself. So, yeah.
Hallelujah. Let us pray.
기도하겠습니다.
Father, in the name of Jesus,
아버지 예수님의 이름으로 기도드립니다.
the most anointed name,
예수님 가장 놀랍게 기름 부음을 받으신 분입니다.
the most exalted name,
예수 이름은 가장 높임을 받으신 이름입니다.
the name above the earth,
그 이름은 모든 이름 위에 뛰어난 이름입니다.
the name above all names.
모든 이름 위에 뛰어난 이름입니다.
Father, be glorified here today.
오늘 이곳에서 그 이름으로 부름을 받으시고 영광을 받으시옵소서.
In the mighty name of Jesus.
능력의 이름 예수 이름으로 기도드립니다.
Lord, as I speak to your people,
주님 오늘 주의 백성들에게 말씀을 전합니다.
please open their spiritual ears
저들의 듣는 귀를 열어주시옵소서.
and their spiritual eyes,
저들의 영적인 눈을 열어주시옵소서.
that they may hear this
그래서 이 말씀을 듣게 하시옵소서.
and see this
그리고 이 말씀을 보게 하시옵소서.
in the mighty name of Jesus.
저는 예수님의 이름으로 기도드립니다.
Amen. Hallelujah.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Kahlil Robert Irving to say a few words about his exhibition at dusk. Thanks, Kahlil. We'll get the video going. Oh, you're muted.
Maybe I'll wait till the video starts. But it's so great to be here with everybody. It's so interesting being at the two previous GRBs and to see my work in the museum that I've been going to for over 10 years. At Dusk is an installation of a series of works that I've been making since 2017, since I graduated from graduate school, and it's kind of the evolution of all of the parts of my practice all in one place. Or maybe I would say not all of them, but a series of variety of gestures that I've been interested in making, from sculpture to found objects to these large wallpaper collages, and the landscape that the content traverses, and then the content that the material and the meaning of the material traverses, all kind of encapsulated within a myriad of perspectives. I got more time, or I could stop, or I could keep talking. I think also a lot of people in St. Louis know me for making these ceramic sculptures, but mostly making pottery. And I saw some people from my previous life before college in the attendance. And so it was also interesting to share a series of works in an exhibition with people who have seen me since I started making things when I was 12 years old. And that reality of what I faced when I was growing up to what I face now, the realities and the conditions by which people live specifically in St. Louis and deal with the content and the social media and the reality constantly being redeveloped around us. This is a kind of amassment of dealing with all the myriad of that content.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, all three of you, for sharing and providing those insights. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our other half of the speakers for this evening, our jurors. Please feel free to turn on your videos. I'd like to introduce, let's see, who do we have first? We've got Christopher Y. Liu, who's the curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Hi, Chris. And hi. And we've got Amanda Ross Ho. Amanda, feel free to join us. Amanda is an artist and associate professor at UC Irvine. Thanks for being here. And lastly, José Carlos Diaz, who's chief curator at the Andy Warhol Museum. Hi, José.
Hi, good evening, everyone.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It's great to see you. I am obviously going to be moderating the discussion tonight. I'm going to ask you all some questions, but I hope that everyone that's watching right now will also send in their own questions and comments. Please use the Q&A function. I'll be happy to pose those inquiries to the artists and jurors after we finished our discussion. Kahlil's eager for the questions, so please do send them in. So to start us off, first question. I thought I would take us way back in time, almost 2 years ago, to the spring of 2019, to talk about the process of reviewing the applications. I wanted the jurors to maybe comment a little bit about, what kinds of things you were looking for in the submissions. Did you have particular criteria, to kind of judge the applications? What stood out in what you saw? And anyone feel free to jump in. I don't want to have to call people. I feel like that's a little bit school teachery.
I'll start. I think one of the really exciting things is we saw such a range of practices, and that includes, all of the final artists that we have here today. But just in general, of all the artists that we saw, there was just like so many innovative and diverse things that people were doing and so many different approaches. And the other thing I felt was like there was a really exciting commitment to the city. It really felt like what artists were doing were really participating in the dialogues that are happening, throughout the artist communities that are there. And that felt really energizing as well. And for me, I think each artist is doing their own thing. And so it's hard to, in some ways, compare one artist to another. I mean, you just see the range of what Tim, Rachel, and Kahlil are doing as just 3 examples. But I feel like one of the things that I look for is that each artist kind of sets his or her own expectations for what the work does, a certain promise that's there. And then for me, it's looking at the work and it's like, does it hold up to those expectations that are being laid out by the artist in that way? Yeah.
Oh, wait, I think Kahlil, go ahead.
Can I ask, so now that you see the work and everything is installed, does it meet or extend past those initial expectations when reviewing the applications, and now that you see the work in the museum?
Ooh, you jumped the gun. That was going to be one of my questions, Kahlil.
I mean, you said it, I just want to open the door, just like, let's just shake.
No, that's great. I think that's great. Let's plant that seed. I love that. I do want to hear what you all, the jurors, think about the final product. That's a great question. But Jose, did you want to comment about the application process at all first?
Yeah, this was a really special application process, and thank you, Misa, for including me. Typically now, during COVID, everything's online, and this gave an opportunity basically to bring in people from coast to coast. I'm in Pittsburgh, and Amanda's in LA, and Christopher's in New York. So I'm a big sucker and big fan for small cities. I'm from Miami, and I live between Miami and Pittsburgh. So I'm always curious of what artists are doing in other places. And my own research for my own shows, I have a show opening up soon, but it's about America. And I want to know and now we're obviously, we're so aware of what's happening in America. So for me, this was a real eye opener in terms of what the excellence of St. Louis is. This was an application process, and we looked at a lot of applications, and the studio visit experience in person was really special. And so I think one of the things that I was looking for was artists that were really prepared. And I think the 3 of you, Tim, Kahlil, and Rachel, you really knew what you wanted to propose to us. You were very well prepared. And there were some great other artists that we did see, and the stage wasn't quite ready yet for what I thought would be ready for the Great Rivers Biennial. But I remember going to the 3 of your studios, and what we see now, the final product, and what we can talk about that later, I see now the evolution of that, which I'm really proud of you for doing. But I saw something that was really, I had never seen before in my own community in Pittsburgh. So you definitely, in terms of media, you were working in different ways that I hadn't experienced. And as Christopher said, the emphasis on place, St. Louis, it really showed in a lot of the artists that we saw. And I think what I really admired is that you did it so strongly, but it really spoke to someone like myself who's not from St. Louis.
So I'll just jump in. Yeah, so, no town or art world or art community is a monolith. And I think we all went into that knowing that. But it's also really interesting to be able to sort of spend a good amount of time and really immerse and get a really broad sense of, how, just the myriad of types of work that was being made. I did not go into the experience with a particular expectation because I felt in many ways that my role was to listen and to kind of, open my eyes to what we were going to encounter. And that definitely was the case. But I think that one of the things that stood out immediately, even though I've said a couple times, the wild diversity in terms of the types of studio spaces and environments that we were looking at and the type of work was wildly interdisciplinary and kind of couldn't be more different from studio to studio. But I think there was a really exciting and kind of important through line that went through all the work, whether it was selected or for the biennial or not, which was, a real, like Christopher said, a commitment to the city, but also kind of engaging ideas of sort of a political engagement with the region in terms of like recent cultural memory. Many people were really head-on confronting class, gender, power, and also we're kind of thinking about it through the lens of, being a person who lives in St. Louis. And so that was really exciting. But also, I think someone said the idea of, sort of the work succeeding upon its own terms. And I think that thinking about this really unique opportunity and what would happen in the sort of incubation period of having the support and the venue and the ability to work with the curatorial, arm of the, museum and like looking at, what work would really sort of be catalyzed in that kind of situation. So I think that's kind of how I went into it. But yeah, there were many, many really interesting kind of aspects to seeing, the connecting points between all the people that we visited. Many people knew each other, most people knew each other, and that was really nice too, to see the close knit kind of aspect of the city. So that's sort of my take.
That's great. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It's nice to hear your reflections about just the kind of richness of the artistic landscape here from a kind of outside perspective. So that's really wonderful. I wanted to move on and ask the artist a question now too, and it has to do with the studio visit process, which kind of came next after the application review. There were 10 finalists that got studio visits. And I also wanted to make a quick side note here and say a huge thank you to the jurors for, participating in kind of a crazy 2-day whirlwind of studio visits where we just went back to back all across the city, Wesson and me, kind of cramming you in the backseat of her car, and just for being such troopers. And I think it was really fun at the same time. But I wanted to ask the artists actually to just kind of comment about that process and maybe how you prepared for your studio visit, maybe talk about your original proposal or idea, what you were hoping to accomplish through the GRB. Did anyone have something specific in mind? Like, I know that Kahlil made kind of like a mock-up of the space to kind of propose a particular idea. I'd just be curious to know how you approached it. Did you want to put forth a particular idea, or was it kind of sharing recent work?
Well, at least I'll go first unless someone else wants to. At least, in terms of like what I showed, I already kind of had a few things percolating, but definitely the benefit of getting the award was that I could make things at a scale that I don't really do ordinarily. And also, like, I know that the work that I would make at that scale would go somewhere that actually can handle that. I think even if I was making work, even if I was making work for the gallery that represents me, there would be issues around size and all that stuff. So you know, that was sort of like the kernel of my proposal, and then also my work taking a slightly new direction. Like this seemed like a good alignment of those two things. So yeah, I showed my most recent work, but definitely had an idea for something new. Also, like the studio visit, I mean, I enjoyed the studio visit because I think the panelists brought up things about the work that I thought, you know, proposed interesting new questions for me to consider. So, you know, my work sort of exists at this weird convergence of different media. So like I talk about my work in terms of painting, but people sometimes look at it from the perspective of photography. So I think there's always like, people bring interesting frames that, you know, make me think about new things.
Yeah, I think my approach was, well, I just come back from a residency, so my studio was just like in shambles. So I just kind of used the space that I had to show that I could take on the scale of the exhibition. Fortunately, my studio is at the Bermuda Project. We have a gallery space that I was fortunate enough to use. And so, you know, I'd never, in a way, like kind of positioned more like one or more of these kinetic pieces together. So it was great kind of getting to create an approach and think about space. The actual studio visit was amazing. I think I was super nervous going into it, of course, because I feel like I was like going to be evaluated, right? And it ended up just feeling like a really organic conversation. I loved hearing just, you know, the jurors like contribute their thoughts, and it was really awesome. There was like this crazy thunderstorm happening at the same time, and like I will never forget, like every time Amanda spoke, like this booming thunder came down, and it was pretty epic. So I think that kind of helped like relax me.
That's how I roll.
You know, we and you know, we had these moments of kind of laughter and connection that yeah, it was really a special moment.
For myself, I two of my closest friends have been awarded the Great Rivers Biennial, and so I got to kind of like be around them as they were preparing and dealing with it. And I just graduated from grad school, so I had already just done a whole bunch of studio visits. I didn't know Chris, and I didn't know Jose, and I didn't know Amanda, so I kind of got a little bit nervous from there. So I was like, I gotta put my best foot forward here. I did propose a different thing than I put in the museum, and that happened for a myriad of reasons. But one of them was partly because of a conversation that I had with a good friend of mine named Jessica. And she said, you know, it's interesting that you've been doing all these things. You're sitting and you're thinking about this, you're mulling over trying to create all this new work in a space where you're oscillating between so many different things, not knowing that the pandemic was about to come upon us. And she said, you know, none of this stuff had really been seen. No one has really seen this stuff in St. Louis besides the people who you're closest to, or who have the means to travel to New York or wherever the work has been exhibited. So I was like, well, I'll do some special commissions for the show, and then I will also show some works that I'm planning to keep for myself. And so there was a way to bridge this gap and to also kind of evolve myself as an artist in St. Louis differently than what people may have or expect of me and from me. So it's been a really interesting situation, but it also makes me think like this is a great opportunity. And I also think like, what other opportunities will artists from St. Louis be able to show in the galleries at the museum? Like when content that is so specific to the city or so specific to issues that we're facing, you know, how can we also put that in the museum, and not just during the GRB, but also during the regular scheduled programming? So I just thought I'd take my point of the show to be able to just put so much together all in one moment.
That's great. Thanks, Kahlil. That kind of leads to the next question. You sort of were already touching on that, but just after you three artists learned that you had received the award, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how your original proposal or ideas kind of shifted through the course of planning your show. Did you kind of edit back? Did you think bigger and, want to add more things? I'm curious to know what the award enabled you to do, or how it kind of shifted your thinking and how your work changed over the course of, I think it was a year, probably with the delay.
I'll go. At least for me, because scale and the amount of sort of resources that the award afforded me sort of made like process and cost of things less of an issue. It became difficult to sort of gauge like when is too much enough, or like I was thinking I could go even bigger. But then there's a certain point when it becomes absurd. So I think that there was a lot of like trying to gauge like what actually is reasonable. But I think the main thing actually, like beyond all this sort of like things that would have changed, was COVID, obviously. And so how that recontextualized the work, thinking about and trying to, at some point I was like thinking about how to account for that, right? Because like we had more time, so we could spend more time making work. But it's really difficult when you're making really labor intensive stuff. So I think that people, at least for my work, because my work has a lot of buildings and empty cities ostensibly, people will read a very different thing than what I may have initially intended. So.
Can you share the question again?
Yeah, I was just kind of curious to hear you each talk about how your work changed from the original proposal or earlier thinking around the show. After you learned that you received the award, how did it shift your thinking? What did it enable you to do? Were you thinking bigger? Were you like, oh, maybe I can hire someone to help me make my work? Like what changes did you make in your own process and practice that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise? And the pandemic is a part of that as well, of course.
I was battling with the fact that the $20,000 is also like the cash, or the honorarium is an honorarium and production budget. And I think a lot of people like, it's like, yes, you have $20,000 you can make art with, but it's also, this is a professional opportunity and you also need to get paid. And so it's like, I was trying to also oscillate and deal with that and think through that quite a bit. But that was like not so big in the effect of what I was thinking about, but I made a wallpaper like the one at the museum for the Contemporary Art Center Cincinnati, and it was like monumental. And it's actually, this wall behind me has like, it was 30 feet high by 60 feet wide, and I have it all packed up behind me. And so I want to reuse it in the future, and I plan to use the vinyl at CAM too. So I thought, like, what could I also make that could also live another life? That CAM exhibition wasn't the only life it could live, or it could only live during GRB, but it could be reborn in a way, and it could allow me space to transform my work into another direction with material that I maybe didn't have readily available in the studio. So it was like a way to also continue to make the work into the feedback loop that people see in the ceramic sculptures with objects that look like they're found, or fragments from the other sculptures or old sculptures that have maybe been broken, or things that look like they're from different places all put to one. Maybe there are other ways that I can use and facilitate that conversation in other material. And so that's why I work with, I try to print most vinyl on photo text. And if you print vinyl, you should print it on photo text, because it's easily removed from the wall and can be reused instead of it going in the trash, which many museums just throw it in the garbage. But I was thinking about that. So it helped after my several conversations and studio visits after winning the award, I just kind of went back to the drawing board of possibilities, especially like the space was different than the one that I had proposed to think about using. And so thinking about using another space, thinking about natural light and different other forces also allowed and forced the work to change.
Yeah, I would say naturally my proposal like is not exactly what I ended up with. Like I imagined this kind of more austere like white wall gallery presentation, and the show ended up being like anything but that. But I don't know, I didn't change too much of the process itself. Like I think it was important that I was still sourcing secondhand massagers, and I got to do a lot more of that, of course, with the funding. But I think the biggest kind of change or possibility that came was collaboration, which you know, I got to work with Kevin Harris from CAM, who helped me figure out how to like not blow out all the power in the museum and wire all these speakers together. And importantly, I got to work with God's Bod, who created the dance track, because I like definitely like cannot make music or a soundtrack. So it was great just being able to rely on their expertise, and then also being able to like pay them a fair price. So that was definitely a change to my process that I really liked.
Are extraneous comments welcome, or are we on a?
Of course. Yeah, please jump in.
I was just thinking as you guys were talking, and I don't want to idealize the sort of vision of the jury, but I do think that there's something interesting and maybe intuitive that was happening, at least in my head, as we were viewing the work. And I see now that we see the shows and the culmination of the exhibitions, which is, I think that I was attracted to and am attracted to in, excuse me, in work, like some sense of futurity, like looking, sort of having a sort of dimensionality of vision that is sort of forward looking. And I think that there's something that was very fortuitous about the three of your practices happening at this moment, and for them to be disrupted by COVID in this way, because there was something about that, you know, certainly in hindsight, we sort of, you know, it's hard to put that all together, but there is something that worked very well to sort of like think about your work in that context too. So I think there's something, yeah, about those sort of things aligning that was pretty special.
And just to jump in too, I think, you know, the other important thing that you're leaving out, Misa, is your own role in the process of making these exhibitions. You know, I think one of the important things about artists showing at museums is that there are curators that are in part of the dialogue in making what happens and helping to shape it as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great learning process, you know, to think about how to fill such a big gallery space. I think for some of you, it might have been your first museum show, and it's thinking about how people will interact with the works, thinking about how to interpret the works for the public, the longevity of the work. I know we had a lot of conversations with Rachel about that. We got a couple of questions already in the Q&A about that, which we can get to in a minute. But yeah, it was great to kind of talk through all of those aspects of the exhibition and to see how they made a big impact on the final result. You both, Amanda and Chris, you both kind of already touched on this, but I was kind of curious to hear your thoughts about seeing the final exhibitions. I mean, you only really got to see the studio visit, and then unfortunately you're not here, so you can't see the exhibitions in person, but I don't know, any thoughts about the direction that the artists took, anything that surprised you or excited you or you weren't expecting to see about the work that's currently on view?
I can jump in, I guess. Yeah, I think what's really incredible about seeing the final product. I haven't seen the show physically, but I've seen the, you know, the videos and I've talked with the artists. But you know, some of the content I saw, you know, years ago, this idea of like loneliness and abandonment, and also confusion and injustice and race in America. I saw those things 2 years ago, 3 years, you know, when we were there, and now the context has shifted a little bit, but that's still there. It's the work is still there. I still see it in the work, and then you throw COVID into this, and then it's yeah, it's just really incredible at the work. The project evolved, I guess, but the content the content was always there. That's why this work was so strong. And now they really speak together. I know, Misa, part of your role was to make this sort of coexist. And that's what I really love about the project and seeing it. When we went to Rachel's studio, for example, I don't know if it was an old church or was it some sort of old little warehouse off the side of the highway. But these massages and things were sort of scattered, but then to see the final product, it's incredible. But everything speaks to me the way it spoke to me before, but it's just, the execution was different in the end. I really commend how the final product looked like, the final exhibition.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think each of the artists didn't veer so far off from what they had originally planned, but it kind of was scaled up and became, ready and appropriate for a museum space, for a museum setting. So I commend all three artists for the work they put in. Any other thoughts about the work currently on view? I was also curious to know if either of you three saw connections between the three artists. I think you've already sort of hinted at the context in which we're living and the relationship to the pandemic, to, social movements that are happening, racial justice movements, but I don't know, anything else you want to comment about, any particular connections between the three artists?
Well, I think it's just really exciting to see what the resultant exhibitions are, just being at the very beginning of the seed of the idea when we were all so excited for all three artists. And I think, even more so, even just looking at the documentation of it, as Jose said, we couldn't see it in person. And it feels to me that each project really went above and beyond what its initial impulse and idea was. The kind of immersive, crazy sound and everything for Rachel's installation, the soundtrack to it was not the thing that I thought about, initially, and then how also all the church recordings really kind of fill the volume of it on top of all the kinetic works, and Tim's works, I just imagine how that immersive scale of those prints are when you're standing in front of it. And then it's almost like looking at like a 19th century painting, or it's almost like, the 19th century equivalent of like a film almost. And Kahlil's work also, I think it's really interesting to think about all these disparate pieces that really come together that almost feels like a total installation. I imagine like the flags are talking to the wallpaper, to the ceramics, everything bounces around. And to me, I think and maybe I wasn't able to zoom out enough from the initial studio visits to think about this connection, but it really feels like all three of you are looking at the things like on the edges of society. If it's literally the objects and things that get discarded and overlooked, or the city itself and the kind of certain plots of land, the way that Tim is creating those, but that you can really almost see, and I don't think it's like a dark nihilistic thing, but there's certainly a through line around what they're all gravitating towards. And it's not all just just like feels like ugly and used, but everything feels alive, but it comes out of what is typically overlooked or discarded, and there's something powerful there.
I was going to say my through line for you guys is time. It feels like all of your work kind of engages these speculative futures in some way, whether it's Tim's work, who's kind of like creating these kind of like patchworks of different forms of entropy kind of collapsing and growing on each other, or I think of Rachel's work as being very much about like the present moment and sort of like celebratory kind of like engagement, and the body and the way that we like worship, the way that we like heal, all these things are like very much like about the present. And then Kahlil, we've talked about your work a little bit since then too, just thinking about more archaeological or geological time, or things that are kind of forces under pressure and things that kind of like end up reacting to those kinds of conditions. So I think there's like a time element that kind of runs through all your work that's actually really interesting, especially given the fact that we had this kind of like delay mechanism kind of get thrown into the middle. And maybe to some degree that was, authored and conscious, and some of it is a result of sort of being in a sustained kind of, condition to make the work too. Like there's got to be some of that comes in naturally to anyone who was in a studio making work during that moment. That was the case, I think. So so thinking about these different time signatures between you guys and the way that, they're almost functioning as proposals to me, which is really an interesting way to work. And together they orchestrate some really kind of like you know, optimistic and also, you know, scary and also like, you know, positive. I mean, there's kind of a lot there, sort of the gamut of like, you know, all of these kind of possibilities. So.
That's great. Thank you so much, everyone. I want to make sure we have time to answer some of these questions from the audience as well. A few of them are specific, less about the process, more about specific artworks, but I think we should address them. So one is to you, Rachel. Ken is asking if you can talk about the lifespan of the exhibit and discuss whether the viewer should think of it differently throughout the life of it, or is it more static for you?
Thanks, Ken, for the question. It's definitely something I haven't figured out completely yet. So if you've seen the show maybe at the beginning and then have visited lately, like it's really kind of fallen apart. A lot of these like plastic gears have just like ground down into dust, and some things have stopped working or you know, torn themselves apart. And I think I'm trying to think of the show as like constantly regenerating. I was also thinking about its possible like future life, you know, going to different venues or shows, like it will kind of need to be like refreshed and pruned. And I think, you know, I've always been kind of self-conscious like making kinetic work because it's, you know, not static, it's not easily collectible, and you know, it's making a racket, obviously. And so, but I think I'm trying to become just more comfortable and like accepting that like this is my work, like it's okay for these works to be, to have so much entropy and to be kind of falling apart. And that's part of the work too. I think of these massagers or pieces like as characters or dancers even in this space. And, you know, some of them can't dance forever. They do it till they drop.
Great, thank you. We have another question for Kahlil. Liz is saying, I found your social media wallpaper incredibly powerful. Your work made me think about the experience of social media and how quickly we toggle between the funny, the tragic, and the profound. Seeing it all in one place, having the opportunity to study it and seeing the statements side by side felt almost overwhelming. How did you decide to put social media on wallpaper, and what kind of impact did you intend to have by doing so?
That's a very interesting question. Um, I started making collages similar to the what's on the wall, but a little bit less chaotic and more thinking of images as textures to print out and put on my sculptures. And my last exhibition, I got to have a conversation with a curator named Ben Chaffee, and he said, well, why don't you think about maybe making these patterns and printing them? And I was like, well, no, it's really specific for a certain process in the other work. And so he was like, oh, well, let's just make a digital print, see how it turns out, and then maybe you can make an edition. So I made that initial edition, and it's kind of just spiraled from there. And it spiraled into this way of having a voice to implicate the institution, implicate the architecture of place, that the work is being shown, that then the space in itself or the building or the location can also be challenged in whatever's being presented, or question the position that the institution or the location has involved in the work or the possibility of the conversation. And so to get to decide that the work is 6 feet by 66 feet, that was because I had this vision that I wanted to wrap the whole walls of the museum. But then having talked with Misa and thinking about our relationship and her collaboration of coordinating, and then also the constraints of the budget, I was like, well, I'm going to do something that I've always wanted to do, is kind of make a belly band. You know, like you have a certain dimension and you have a central area that's maybe blank or filled with specific content. And so I thought of the wall not only engaging in this film strip or this continuation or algorithmic lineage of time, but also Oh shoot, I just lost it. Almost as a framing device for direction in the gallery. So there's a location, physical location that also manifests where we're on the ground and then this fictional sky is above us. So that's kind of how I got there. It's in the direction of how we view our phones and watch our computers.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have another question for Rachel. Sorry to put you on the spot, but people have questions for you. Rachel, my experience of Gather, not mine, Liz's experience of Gather was one of pure unadulterated joy. I found myself wanting to party with those plants. Your materials talk about how your urge to create this piece came out of not quite feeling at home in the Korean church or in the LGBTQ spaces. Will you share a little bit about how you managed to create a space of belonging out of a space of disconnection?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Liz. Yeah, I think, initially I kind of conceived of this space being like, these pieces are moving super awkwardly, but they're kind of just like happy and doing their thing. And in a way that was kind of comforting for me because I've never felt like super comfortable on the dance floor, nor have I felt like super comfortable like in the church spaces that I grew up in. A lot of this kind of the way the space changed came because of COVID and because of having to shut everything down. I had conceived of it being like a dance party before the shutdown, but it really gave it a new meaning because suddenly nobody could gather anymore, right? Clubs and churches and things were closed down, and a lot of them are like reopened, which whatever. But it really became not just a space of like joy and celebration, but also like one of yearning and this kind of like desire to belong. And it's been really kind of amazing getting messages from people saying, it gave them that kind of feeling, like they kind of walked in and they felt greeted and welcomed and like they could just like, be themselves and dance even in this space. And, people say like, I missed my queer family and I missed, being around people and dancing and getting sweaty and wild. And for a moment I got to experience that in the show. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess it wasn't, my intent from the beginning, but it's something that really kind of changed again because of COVID. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, lots of questions coming in. I'm going to ask a question of Tim. What social imaginaries are you depicting in your work that you think are unique to St. Louis? Are there similarities between these and the other cities in other work you've done, like San Bernardino or Camden, New Jersey?
Sorry, I'm like a Zoom veteran, so this is the second time today I've done this. So, I mean, this body of work is actually different from previous bodies of work, where I'm not focused on like one particular city. I'm kind of thinking about like the skyline of most American cities right now, including St. Louis. So it's kind of a combination of things from different places that I visited in the last 2 or 3 years. I think that there are definitely elements that I've borrowed from St. Louis, and I mean there's like 2 or 3 distinct periods in the past that I'm looking at St. Louis, and I'm still doing research on St. Louis for like a future project. But like the 2 or 3 eras that I'm looking at, one is the early 20th century, and one is the mid 20th century, and I think those both imagined a different kind of idea about work and labor. So like the Lewis and Clark Tower imagined sort of like upper middle class cosmopolitan society, and like there's jobs and things that went with that. I think with some of the cities that have like new architecture, I guess, it's there's still like a range of things that people are imagining, but I would say that that basically everyone has a job where they can be on Zoom, right?
Okay, great. Let's see. There was one question. Oh, I think Kahlil just answered it in the chat, but one person was asking about your particular studios. So it's less of a specific question about an artwork, but more about your studio process. What are the most significant things about your studio? What makes it a place in which you can do your best work? Does anyone want to try to answer that? Or Kahlil, do you want to kind of vocalize what you just typed in?
Well, I could say it, expand on it a little bit more. This question about the studio is really interesting to me because my studio has been in flux ever since I was in graduate school. And one of my, I don't know if it was in grad school or on, no, I think it was in grad school. My advisor told me, she said, you need to make sure that you can be able to do your work at home. So you got to figure out a way to get the equipment that you need and not be dependent on an institution. And I was like, nah, I'm gonna go do residencies. I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna live my life the way I want to live my life. And it took me to do all these awesome things, but it also took me away from having a certain kind of grounding and solidity and kind of like an anchor. I have a studio, but it's not built out and it doesn't have all the fancy bells and whistles that all the institutions I've done residencies at have. And so what does it really mean to invest in yourself and gather the equipment that you need to be able to do that quote unquote best work? Or can your best work be done in a space where then all the things that you need are things that you bring? And it doesn't necessarily be this like beautiful heavy equipment, but it's a space to truly process the content. So I think there are multiple realms to really get into that, but I appreciate the question, and I would say all of it is still in flux for me.
Yeah, I mentioned this earlier, but I'm fortunate to have like a gallery space attached to my studio. So I kind of almost see them as like my actual studio space, which is like maybe like 150 square feet, is like kind of like the lab, or like, you know, where I'm tinkering with these machines. And then I kind of bring them out to the gallery and I would let them run and kind of test and make sure that they worked over, you know, several hours. And as I kind of started, you know, piling up more and more massagers, and the gallery became more full, I could start to kind of mock up like the experience of going into the space, because the square footage was like roughly the same as Gallery C. But you know, it was really important to have that space because I wouldn't have made the show that I had now without it. Like, it would all have been kind of hypothetical. And therefore I would have just showed up to the museum and just kind of set everything up as I had it in my head. But because I could just, you know, run the machines, I stood there and I was like, you know, this needs music, and, you know, they need to be elevated on speakers. And this was you know, definitely a part of the process that was, I've never had the chance to have before, because I've never had so long to work on one show. And so to also kind of answer that question in the chat about the disco ball, no, it was not originally part of the plan. But once I was like, okay, it needs to have music, you know, I was like, why not? We're throwing in a disco ball. It's going to be a party.
Great. Okay, well, we have a question in the chat also for me from Ido, and he is just wondering about my role in the exhibition as curator. And so I thought I'd just briefly address that. You know, a juried exhibition is a little bit different just because, you know, I didn't select the artist, but I thought the whole process of working with my colleagues here on this call was fantastic. And everything after that point was all just what I normally would do, is just working with an artist, supporting them, being a kind of sounding board for them. I think some artists want to have more conversations, some want fewer, some want studio visits, others want to just email and kind of check in occasionally. So it's just being adaptable and being there as the kind of, again, the sounding board. And I mentioned this earlier, but helping the artists, especially if it's their first museum show, to just think about what that means, what it means in terms of spatial, you know, understanding of the gallery. That's my expertise, is knowing, you know, how to fill the gallery space. I know the museum. So answering questions like that, or, you know, any concerns that the visitor services might have about how people might interact with the work. It's that kind of, some of it's kind of boring, that I must admit that is part of my job, but the safety and the security of the artwork, that's always a part of the conversation as well. So it was a great process to work with the jurors. It really was unlike other exhibitions I've worked on. So, and it was one of my first kind of lead roles in a curator position at CAM. So it was really just a lot of fun. I'm trying to see if there's any more.
Sorry, Misa, I was gonna add, you had a bigger role too on the other side of things. You were this cultural connector, because then you were communicating with the panelists, or Amanda and Christopher and I. You're sort of the connective tissue throughout the duration of the show, through the programming, through the brochure, through the videos you showed through tonight. But even to this moment, like I've talked about the artists here tonight, but also the other studio visits. I've mentioned it to other curators. So there is this little network here, and you're part of that, Misa. And because you've invited us to be part of this, this conversation, and which turned into an exhibition, this biennial. Yeah, that's a really important role that you played, because you've connected all of us together. So I do commend you for that as well. It's not just logistics. So I think you, and beyond the biennial, I know who you are, and I've mentioned you, all three of you, to other curators and collectors, and Kahlil, I've seen your work in Palm Beach. So yes, I think it's a bigger thing than beyond just a St. Louis, CAM St. Louis, one-time exhibition biennial. So anyways, I commend you, Misa.
I want to echo too, kind of a similar thing, just in terms of the way that this whole kind of program, which from the beginning was, I thought really unique, but then again, to have this additional kind of gap made this truly like quite a long relationship, right? And there's something really just nice about that, even though, obviously we couldn't come there and that part was sad, but there's something about being in communication over this period of time that is sort of like a longer period than you maybe normally would in the metabolism of a project, that has been really, I don't know, something really nice to be able to kind of like have this, kind of extended sustain. For some reason that feels resistant to some of the kind of like speed of other things that, often just you kind of like do as best you can, and you inevitably have to move forward to the next thing. And there's been something really nice about the slowing down of this and everything else too. But yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Sorry, I think I froze there. Might have missed the end, but I feel like that is just such an amazing place to end. I don't know. I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for this entire process. I feel super lucky that I've gotten to be the one, like you were saying, Jose, that's like connected to everyone. I've gotten to have all these conversations with each of the artists over such a much longer period of time. And so I'm super grateful for that, and for all of you and your participation. So thank you. And thank you for everyone who is out there watching tonight. And I have to say the show closes in a week and a half, and I can't believe it, because I mean, it seemed like it was going to be so far out in the future, but now it's a week and a half away, and it's we're booking up. So hop online, make a reservation, come visit us soon. And until then, just stay well, everyone, and thank you for being here.
And congratulations, you guys.
Thank you.
Congrats again to all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Everyone.
See you soon.